Okay, hello, and welcome to our first week of class. We're going to get started with an overview this week of management and some of the related theories and concepts. It'll provide more context for Chapter 1 in the Evans and O'Leary text, and it'll also help with the introduction post-assignment that's due at the end of this week. And one thing I do want to point out, this is the sort of recorded narrated lecture. You can also download a copy of the slides with the speaker notes just in case you want to refer back or read through it as you need. Okay, so in Chapter 1, in the text, we've got a really nice introduction to management as both a principle and a practice. Over the course of this semester, we're really going to get into different aspects of managing a library and the information service, so the finances, the people, communication, technologies, etc. But to start off, we're going to take a look at some of what makes a good manager. So we will definitely get into this more as we go throughout the course. And there's a culminating assignment at the end of the semester that asks you to describe your managerial philosophy as a sort of elevator pitch, which, just as an aside, I will say is really useful when you're applying for jobs as a manager or a supervisor, because it's inevitable to be asked that question. What's your managerial philosophy, or how do you go about managing libraries? So it'll be a really good exercise, I think, for you. So there are a lot of definitions of what a manager is. If you read Harvard Business Review or Forbes, you'll likely see lots of different examples and definitions, but here are a couple of definitions that the text mentions. I think it's crucial to remember that by definition of being a manager, you are supervising people in an organization, but you also, oftentimes this is thought of as managing the people below you, but in addition, you also have to manage above you, your boss or your administrators or whoever you report to. And then also sometimes beside you, so your peers in the organization or a board of trust, etc. It's not just about the people, though. In many situations in libraries, you also will be managing processes, facilities, budgets, etc. Evans and O'Leary do mention this, and I think it's worth noting that an important part of management is understanding the work of those you supervise. You don't have to be an expert. That's why that person has a job. But in order to effectively lead, you really need to understand what all of your employees and staff do and be ready to jump in and help if necessary. So I'm just curious what you think about this question. I would consider this just a little bit. Is management relevant in libraries? Libraries are complex organizations, and even the smallest libraries still require management. When I was at college and library, in a college and library. When I was in college, I managed a library in a law firm, and it wasn't an official library by any means. It was just a room full of books for the attorneys to use. However, we did have a budget, we were accountable to the lawyers, and we needed to integrate technology into the work of the firm. So even though it wasn't an official or a formal library, still in order for it to run smoothly, it needed to be managed. So my answer to this question is yes, absolutely. Libraries need management, and it is extremely relevant because, as we'll talk about later, advocacy is really important, and that's a big piece of managers' jobs. In the text, Harry Mintzberg lists 3 major categories of a manager's roles. So these are important organizational skill sets that include roles related to being a figurehead, a liaison, a spokesperson, a resource allocator, a politician, and more. I can attest that being a manager requires you to fill all of these roles and more, really and more. Successful managers know when they need to shift from one of these roles to another, and or when they need to delegate some of these roles to their trusted colleagues. No one can do it all, and one of the biggest parts of being a manager is realizing when to call in help and when you don't know an answer or when someone else might be the better person to refer to. And we're going to really talk about this in week 3 when we talk about legal issues. The question of how many people to manage is really a good one. Research has shown that around 5 to 7 people per manager is ideal in order to maintain control over the work happening in the unit, or our case in the library, and to provide the kind of feedback and mentoring that will help those employees grow. Think about experiences you've had either with people that you've worked with or libraries that you've studied. Is this number normal or standard, particularly in libraries? I found it very difficult and different to kind of suss out everywhere that I've worked, but I've seen the most successful situations where the number of supervisees is close to 5 or 7. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the levels of management and leadership. We're going to look sort of from the top down here, which isn't my favorite way to look, but that's what we're doing. So we're going to start here with the top management. And again, this is not set in stone for every single library. It's going to be a little bit different depending on what type of environment or organization you're in, but typically for top levels, and usually this is in most types of libraries, public, academic, special, school, you have some sort of director, associate director who often are on a leadership team. They will usually be the one to develop the strategic vision of the library, help set policies for the organization, and sometimes, although this is not always the best or right strategy, they're the most visible person within the organization. The thing to remember about this level of management is that the colloquialism, the buck stops here, is often associated with the higher levels of management. If lower level employees make a mistake, often their leaders are the ones that have to answer for it or are ultimately responsible. So next, going down the line is middle managers. So these are people like department heads or branch managers. They often have to do a lot of what I was referring to earlier of top up and bottom down leading. They communicate with both their administration and the frontline staff. In my experience, the middle management role is extremely important in bigger organizations. Otherwise, the staff on the front lines feel too disconnected from upper administration. The job of the middle manager is to make sure that everyone within the organization that reports to them in particular is fulfilling the mission and vision of the library, and they can also see how their job or role fits into that bigger picture. So they must also then advocate for their employees to the upper administration. So there's that down and up sort of mentality there. Finally, we get to first line supervisors. So note, we're not really talking about the just individual non-managing employees. This is sort of the bottom level of management. These are employees that are often doing the bulk of the work in the library, but also supervise staff, and sometimes part-time or temporary workers or student employees, interns. As an example of this that works both in public and academic library settings is a circulation supervisor that may report to a department head, a branch library, or a head of public services. These supervisors often do the work of running the circulation desk and public services day to day, but then they also supervise circulation assistants and then maybe, as I mentioned, interns or student workers as well. So we've looked at who managers are and where they may fit into the organizational structure, but let's shift to talking about what they actually do, although we have mentioned a little bit of that here and there. Most management texts are structured by covering these areas that you see here, focusing on a range of different aspects. One of the keys here is that I kind of want to push back on a little bit is the idea of controlling. And I'm curious if you think that this is the job of managers. These definitions seem to create more of an autocratic function versus one that is flexible or responsive to environmental factors. So I'm not sure from my experience of it if it really makes the most sense there, but I don't know. I'll leave that up for discussion and hear what you all have to say. As we see in the textbook, Mintzberg offers alternative ways of looking at the functionality of managers. So we're going to examine a little bit of that here. So we discussed these categories and roles a little bit earlier, but it's important to understand that there are a lot of different functions and activities in which a manager needs to be engaged. So Mintzberg discusses these three categories with a variety of roles within them. The interpersonal, informational, and decisional are the main categories, and then we've got this number of sort of flexible and changing roles beneath. So think about managers that you have known, or if you've been a manager, your own role. Which of these areas have you observed? Or does one tend to stand up a little bit more than others? I think it depends a lot on your organization and really the people that you work with too. To expand on Mintzberg's functions, as you might expect, managers do all sorts of activities, including outreach activities, such as planning events and direction for the library, human resources, which includes hiring, training, making staffing decisions, shifting roles, functioning in political roles, which includes meeting with external constituents. So these could be boards, administrators, the public, often writing press releases, announcements about new events, things like that. And then also serving as leaders, not only of their units, but also within the organization. Here are a few questions and considerations for you to think about. Is it worth considering each leadership managerial position in libraries that may have different applications of the managerial roles? So for example, a leader of copy catalogers versus a branch library head versus the director of a research library. A lot of similarities in terms of the roles that Mintzberg discussed, but also there, this is kind of what I was hinting on earlier, that some of the roles are going to be a little bit more higher up on the list of priorities than others, depending on what type of position you're in. So as we're going through this, consider the type of library that you're interested in and what types of roles might be most important. I know several of you are interested in archives. So if you wanted to move into a management position, what of those roles that we looked at just a few minutes ago would be most important? Resource allocator comes to mind for sure. Okay. So next, let's move on to the different resources that enable managers to do their jobs well. As I mentioned earlier, managers need to consistently need to consistently deal with different functions of organizational culture, such as the human resources, which is the people, different components of that include, as we talked about, staffing, training, etc. Finances and budget, the library's facilities, and the collections and resources that make up the library, which we're going to cover all of these this semester, so stay tuned for that. So what type of skills are needed and necessary to function within the Mintzberg categories? So here are a couple of examples for you. The resources that a manager has influence over that we talked about in this last slide, so these lists here. These are some of the skills that are needed in order to sort of be over those particular areas and work in the different parts of the organization. So the political we talked about, analytical, definitely being a people person. You cannot be a manager without being a people person and having good interpersonal skills. It just can't happen. And then financial and systems, which again, we'll talk about a little bit more this semester. So another question to kind of think about is if years of experience have any impact on someone's ability to lead. Unfortunately, this is a really common sentiment, and as librarians are getting ready to start your careers, and you may be interested in management and wanting to go into a role fairly soon, how might you respond to a question like this? It's unfortunately common, but I definitely think that the skill set that you bring to the table is extremely important. And it's also worth thinking about some of the work you've done that may not be an official management position, but that the skills that you used in those situations, like leading a committee, leading a study group in graduate school, those can all be applied to management roles. Okay, and so Managerial skills are definitely going to be similar throughout any level. So we talked about the top, middle, and frontline supervisors. But certain aspects are definitely more nuanced and heightened at different levels of management, as I mentioned. So for example, as we discussed earlier about needing to have a sense of what frontline staff deal with on a day-to-day basis, many frontline supervisors and middle managers need to have both technical and conceptual skills, both so that they complete tasks that need to be done, but also think about the bigger picture of the organization and how their work fits into the organizational goals and missions. Okay, so that wraps up this week's lecture. A lot of things to think about here. Definitely think about some of these issues as you're completing your introductory post this week. And I'm really looking forward to reading those and seeing what colors you all are, and you'll get to see what color I am too. So, all right, thanks. Have a great week.